You're listening to 1232, an audio epic, produced by RumbleStump Entertainment. Chapter 26. Only 2 people knew that Zorreale's fortress had a private garden, and one of them was deranged. The other made sure he stayed that way. Underground, below the original stone keep, was Zorreale's garden, its only resident, Thomas Hoffman, formerly a Black Dagger helicopter pilot. Since the beheading of John Thatcher, Hoffman was held captive, not to chains, but to a sickness of the mind, a madness, which had intensified in recent months. He began ringing his collection of bells hung all over his chamber.
I hear you! I hear you! I hear you! I hear you!
He cried, repeating it over the deafening racket. Zorreale's voice echoed down the long, hidden stairwell.
Oh, Tomas, my dear friend, how is my dog?
He stopped ringing bells and began frantically straightening everything and sweeping off the benches that lined the walls.
Too much dust.
For a dungeon, it was perfectly neat.
My queen, my lady.
Still, he worked himself into a frenzy to make it presentable.
That looks better. That's
May I come in?
Yes, I think she'll be impressed.
Asked Zorreale, standing at the entrance, where there was no door.
Oh, yes, my lady, please come in.
He said breathlessly. He rattled on, at last sitting on the floor at her feet.
I was not expecting you so soon.
I brought you your favorite brew. I know you love the ale I always bring you, made from Mandragora.
She handed him a leather skin full of a dark, oily liquid, which he accepted graciously and promptly chugged. Zorreale took a tour of the room, examining all the lovely flowers and fountains that he had been tending. All the while, Hoffman chattered incessantly about helicopters, modern engineering, and tales of world wars and weapons of mass destruction.
A dragonfly, like a dragonfly.
Zorreale could not even imagine the things he spoke of, but she was enthralled by it. She listened kindly to every word he said, sometimes taking his arm in hers and smiling at him. After a while, his speech slurred. A few more minutes, and he was in a trance, silent as the grave. Zorreale glanced about her. She chuckled as her eyes rested on Hoffman. He was dangerously thin, his skin nearly transparent from not seeing the sun in years. His hair and his beard were thin and long, filthy and matted. The man's poor health not improved by the potion she was giving him, a pitiful thing to behold. But to her, he was right where she wanted him.
Every scheme to which I have assigned you has proven your madness and your cleverness to be valuable to me. Your black powder and my magic have worked well together. I have burned the rebels out. They did not suspect that we had been laying the magic powder around their camp. Now, I want something else from you. I want a weapon that no man, no knight can stand against.
Zorreale paused, pensive. She paced up and down the cell before continuing.
These terrible weapons you speak of, these world wars, will not my magic, paired with these machines, cause more damage than any man has ever seen? I know you can make such a machine that no castle can stand against. The Normans send lords marching into Wales, but I will march over England into Normandy. Men, priests, peasants bowing to me, casting out the fools. You will make this weapon for me.
She stopped, facing him, and commanded,
Tell me what this shall be.
Hoffman responded like a robot, describing a bomb. Zorreale silenced him, not truly comprehending. He trembled and started again, describing a firearm.
It's like a metal, the shininess of like a sword, but dark or different colors, and the person, the one controlling this is inside the
Zorreale
barrel.
listened, wide-eyed with satisfaction, and yet her emotions were mixed. She couldn't wrap her head completely around the idea. This made her nervous, but the repercussions of losing her hold on Brecon were far more dangerous. She waited, pondering,
A lot of wind.
until Hoffman came to and spoke voluntarily.
Oh, how can I explain?
She then left him a bundle containing food and water and promised to return soon. He wouldn't stop obsessively kissing her hand as she left. But when he was alone, he found some parchment, lit another candle, and started drawing plans for a muzzle-loading black powder cannon. But as he worked, his mind unraveled, talking of roses and planting more in his garden.
Oh, look at this one, It's so beautiful. Look at the leaves. Look at the petals. It's... but that...
Zorreale's secret weapon, as it were, gave her the confidence and the hope that her ambitions could be realized with the technology Hoffman possessed from the future. If only she could grasp his knowledge, his power could become her reality. Hoffman was useless otherwise. Zorreale was not the only one with secrets. Ragar, too, had an ace up his sleeve, a prisoner. Forgotten until now, this prisoner was chained and barred in the watchtower, locked away from the world in every way. A cold, whistling wind woke him. The incessant beating of rain on the wall outside turned the air in the cell even colder. His chains made a heartless clanking sound as he straightened, listening to the wind. How long had it been since he'd seen anyone? How long since there had been any light? How long since he'd eaten? There was no way of knowing. Weeks, days, nights. Time was inapplicable. There was only the terrible pain of hunger in his gut, so powerful it could curl his whole body into a ball and twist his mind toward hopelessness. A sound startled him. He jerked up, his head weaving as he tried to stay alert. Footsteps, voices, light stabbing through cracks in the door. When it swung open, he had to close his eyes. Even candlelight was blinding. Someone was there. Someone was speaking to him. But he couldn't understand them. They threw a loaf of bread within his reach and a skin of water. The door shut. The light disappeared. He took the bread and broke off one piece. His swollen tongue and cracked lips muttered a word of thanks. He ate it, and then, in a measured and calm effort, he struggled to uncork the skin of water. Once that was done, he let some of it drip onto his tongue and swallowed. It would be who knows how long before he got any more. He had to make this last until then. Without a warning, a golden light glowed in the opposite corner of the cell. It took form and a shape. A shining being in bright armor was kneeling in front of him. It spoke.
Lachlan, do not despair. Your God has heard you. He will deliver you. Your God has not forgotten you.
The voice rang in the air like a bell, a deep sound, as if it began in another world. Lachlan's heart filled with courage. He ate more bread and drank a little more water. While he could no longer see the angel, the light remained somehow. Hope had come to the prison of despair. Hello, 1232 listeners. This is Callie Sioux, and I'm excited to tell you about Dramify, the ultimate platform for creators and fans of audio dramas. With oodles of genres, hundreds of shows, and thousands of episodes, Dramify is your go-to streaming service exclusively for family-friendly audio dramas. Whether you're a devoted listener or a creator of a family-friendly masterpiece, Dramify has something for you. And guess what, 1232 listeners? You can now enjoy 1232 on Dramify. Just go to dramify.com/1232. That's DRAMAFY.com/1232 and get started for free. Happy listening.
This episode of 1232 is sponsored in part by Oasis Family Media and its family of companies including Oasis Audio, Enclave Publishing, and Sky Turtle Press. Publishers of the forthcoming epic Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, rendered in modern prose by Rebecca K. Reynolds and illustrated by Justin Gerard. For more information, visit fairyqueen.com. That's fairyqueen.com, or find the link in the description below.
And now, back to the show. Early and without fail, Zorreale visited her stables each day. Her prized Spanish stallion, Calabozo, was her primary concern on one of her good days. If anything was amiss inside the stall, the stable hands were duly punished. As of late, though the rebels were on the run, she had become more paranoid as to the state of the keep, but especially to Calabozo. Several mares and colts were stabled with him, along with Ragar's destrier. Both he and Calabozo were daily schooled and exercised outside the gate by Gareth, Llewellyn's old horsemaster, press-ganged into service. Most of the horses were for the Black Riders, 1 or 2 chargers, but the rest were quality palfreys, bred by the Llewellyns. They were corralled inside the castle bailey at night. The men had more reasons to be cautious over their mounts, because of the rebels and the brazen move to set fire to the stables. No expense was spared to rebuild the burnt stable. Better accommodations than the slaves of Brecon town. Still, Zorreale became increasingly mad with the idea that her Jhett was kept in the courtyard at all. It was never easy to predict the emotional rages or swells that came from Zorreale. Many assumed it was her Spanish temper that overtook her, or they accused her, in confidence, of being a crazed and depraved woman. These whispered explanations could explain a percentage of her mood, but the deeper reason, as Zorreale well knew, was the dark, hungry devils that lived alongside her. Her mind was not hers alone, and many years ago, she had opened it up to guests who lived happily in a tumultuous harmony. They rose their heads at any given moment, bringing to boil within her the desire to listen to them. They increased her power, increased her pleasure, and, most assuredly, increased her anger. Today, they warned her, goading her towards certain decisions, and she was happy to oblige.
I want Calabozo in the throne. Bring water, straw, good oats. I'll not have him live in this flimsy stable another day. Why should he have to endure the winters here? Look at this roof. It's worthless,
she said as water came dripping down on her head from above. She paraded through the fog and dampness as if the sun were shining. Everyone watched as Gareth led the horse into the great hall after her. Once the door was shut, whispers began again of the madwoman, the witch, but they were hurriedly hushed from fear of being overheard and her wrath brought down on them. Her throne room was Llewellyn the Great's old hall, part of the large stone house Cardigan and his family were raised in. Llewellyn was responsible for many fortresses across the country and dwelled in them only seasonally. Cardigan and his brother Lachlan had come to this one in their late teens and were charged to be regents over Brecknockshire. The young boys did very little to improve the keep, and only as they aged did they see the importance of a strong castle. With Llewellyn ill and called elsewhere, Powys had become a target for many of the Norman marching lords sent by the English king. When Zorreale came to possess it, with Hoffman's input, she built a fortress of timber and stone around the hall. The compound spread across the natural knoll that rested above the River Hondie, crossing the Usk. Its only weakness being that the outer wall was made of timber. Hoffman had given her the idea to ensure the walls were not breached, and thusly, she housed her slaves inside it, knowing the rebels would not attempt to burn it. In the days of his early arrival, John Thatcher had studied the Great Hall, made of stone, before his capture, and before Zorreale had taken it. He knew all of the underground tunnels, and thanks to a gut feeling, he hadn't trusted Hoffman with that information. Zorreale knew nothing of the labyrinth beneath her feet, and had no reason to look for them until Cardigan's escape. The tunnels had been well disguised and covered by years of soil and sediment. John Thatcher had revealed nothing when she tortured him, and none of her other assets had revealed anything about the tunnels either. The matter forgotten. The women and children kept in the wooden walls were reason enough for her to sleep well, knowing Cardigan would never attempt such an attack on the keep. The fog shrouded the watchtower that stood over the hall, built on top of what used to be a chapel. She used the chambers in the hall as well, one in particular. This was where she was going now, up the long stairs to the room where the carol stone sat on a small table in front of a fireplace. Hoffman created a crude version of a coal lamp, which Zorreale put to use all over her fortress. She could send the people to mine coal until they died. The mining was nothing but shallow grave digging, and just enough coal was produced for Hoffman to begin the making of the lamps. Before he went completely insane, he had instructed several of the craftsmen's slaves to make them. These same lamps lit the room, along with one gloriously crafted stained glass window. Zorreale circled the table, as if she were afraid to get too close to the stone. Visions would come to her. She would stop and gasp, sometimes grabbing her head in pain with both hands. Then, when the visions faded, her eyes would open, and she would rant and mutter for several minutes until she ran out of breath. When light no longer illuminated the colors in the glass window, Zorreale left the room and meditated on the temptations and warnings the visions had shown her. Down in the throne room, Ragar and his squire were being served by two thin, timid servants who brought them the fat of the land. A roast lamb was laid on the table before a great roaring fire on the hearth, with loaves of bread and roasted game hen and other food, every inch of the table covered in rich fare, not to mention the locally made mead. Earlier, they had ridden back to survey the burned rebel camp and look for survivors. His search was quick, for he counted on Vera to keep her promise and deliver the priest. This was just for show, so Zorreale would think he was working. He was feeling the pressing of time upon his shoulders, the murmurs of age as the errands became more and more cumbersome. Zorreale came down and stopped, waiting. Everyone in the room stopped too, and stood, then bowed. They waited until she sat down, and then finally returned to what they were doing before. Ragar, the last to do so. He made sure Zorreale noticed.
I will rule all of Wales. The future has come to me. We shall rule all of Britain. Perhaps you will rise in rank if you prove yourself.
Like always, she was slightly teasing. It would have been hard to know for sure. Her hazel eyes reflected the fire, easily mistaken for a jolly twinkle. Ragar raised his head and smiled.
Your whim is my command,
he said, sitting up and leaning on one arm of his chair. He studied her, a look of curious amusement on his face. Ragar didn't give in to her every whim, but since he met her, he had lacked nothing. He still meant to take power when the time was right, but she had been especially useful in subduing the people. They were superstitious, and it amused him. Besides, the fringe benefit of hunting and killing Christians made up for any dissatisfaction. A poor Dane by birth, Ragar was one of many among the hordes of the far northern countries to mistrust Christianity. There, the message was leverage, and much bloodshed came about on account of it. In the Viking lands, people had survived by greed and might for centuries. To lay down their weapons and follow the true message of the Christ was so contradictory to their way of life that they could only reject it. Peace with the tribes they had plundered over the years was a revolting idea to most, not to mention the notions of love or compassion. But to bend with the winds of change, they conceded. Knowing full well the world outside was embracing the message of the Christ, the people sought equality, and Christianity had brought it under not a king, but one compassionate God. This concession only lasted until they used the religion to satisfy their lust for power and death. The leaders gave their people a choice: convert or die. Thus, driving the eternal gospel of the Christ far away from the north, and painting the map red in the name of Christianity. Ragar had grown up with such barbarity. It had seeped into his soul. But in the increase of the Normans' power, diplomatic negotiations, not the might of the axe, became a more effective weapon. Knights, chivalry, and courts were the battlefield, and the Danes, along with their sister countries, had to concede. Thus, many bloodthirsty warriors were at a loss for a cause. If they went on raids, they were punished and shunned. But Ragar could never bow to authority, and was slow to change his ways. He fled Danish territory to live as a mercenary for hire. The Normans needed warriors to subdue the Llewellyns in the west and the Scots in the north. Ragar found a calling for a short while, soon taking command of a small battalion. Then Zorreale stepped into the picture, calling upon the old ways for ruthless tactics. Ragar and his men eagerly joined her. He felt he belonged where his skills were in demand. The thought teased a chuckle from him. Ragar took a sip and smiled to himself, recalling their first encounter and the promise she had always made to rule side by side on this small island.
Leave!
Zorreale demanded. Everyone but Ragar scurried from the room. They were alone, except for her stallion, Calabozo, standing in the room's corner on a bed of straw. Zorreale stood up and slowly crossed to Ragar's end of the table. She picked up the pitcher of mead and topped off Ragar's cup. He watched her serve him and couldn't hide the satisfaction on his face.
To rule, I must have someone who obeys me without question. Anything I ask.
Anything, my lady?
Yes, whatever I want.
Milady, I am at your service, as I have proven these past years.
I want more than your fealty. You must pledge me your allegiance until death. Your sword, your life, your soul.
Zorreale's eyes, burning like dark coals, locked with Ragar's. Ragar took a deep drink of his mead. He wasn't completely serious, betting that Zorreale wasn't either. She liked to tease him and toy with him, because she was a woman. Why not let her think she was getting what she wanted?
My lady, what is in store for me? Should I pledge you my life?
Ragar took another drink.
I promise you power, Ragar. Power and wealth. If you promise me your unconditional obedience.
Zorreale leaned towards him. Ragar blinked. The strength of the mead pressed in on his temple. He seemed to see double and couldn't hold his head still. Zorreale pulled out her dagger.
Take the oath. Seal it with blood. You will have everything your heart desires.
She said, her lips drawn thin, similar to a smile, but far more canine. Ragar was cognitive enough to realize that this was an ultimatum. Eventually, he held out his hand to her. She took it and sliced the palm. His senses rushed to him for only a moment, as his nerves sent a painful message to his brain. His eyes drooped, focusing on the details of her braids. She spit into the wound and closed his hand into a fist. Ragar heard her faint chanting as the dying fire faded to black. You've been listening to episode 25 of 1232. Get ready for a special Q&A after episode 26. Submit your questions about the show, story, or production now via audio-epic.com and get mentioned while the creators answer your questions. This episode was produced by RumbleStump Entertainment, written by Callie, Sioux, and Cheyenne Belle, narrated by Callie, Sioux. Today's voice talents include Robin Scott as Hoffman, Jessica King as Zorreale, Jonathan Cooke as Ragar, and J.T. Sutter as the voice of the angel. This episode was mixed and engineered by Jhett Black, with editing and sound design by Casey Caballero, Caballero Sounds. Music by Callie, Sioux, and Jhett Black, with Static Line now available wherever you listen to music. Mastered by Zach Bryant, 9-Man Mastering. Cover art by Niall C. Grant. This episode was made possible by our generous and incredible supporters through Kickstarter. You know who you are. To our knights, our bards, Welsh bowmen, wizards, and chieftains, thank you. Continue the adventure in episode 26.